A quill touches parchment. The ink is wet. A hand hesitates, just for a second, before it moves. This is not a battlefield. There are no swords here, no cannons, no smoke rising over a field. Just a quiet room, a long wooden table, and a single sheet of paper. But for the men gathered in that room, this moment was more dangerous than any battle they would ever fight. Every name written down that day could be read in two completely different ways. To some, it would mark the birth of a new nation. To others, to the government they were standing against it, would be a signed confession of treason. 56 signatures. 56 gambles. One nation. And on that summer day in Philadelphia, not one of those 56 men knew which way the story would end. They were not signing a finished victory. They were signing a bet. By the summer of 1776, the words themselves were already written. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress had voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, they formally approved the text of the Declaration of Independence, the document that explained, in bold and unforgettable language, why the 13 colonies believed they had the right to govern themselves. The words were powerful. They spoke of equality among men, of the right to life and liberty, of a government that exists only because the people allow it to. Today, those lines are some of the most quoted sentences in the English language. But in the summer of 1776, words on paper changed almost nothing by themselves. Under British law, King George III's authority over the American colonies was still seen as completely lawful. A declaration without a single name attached to it was just an idea floating in the air. And an idea, no matter how well written, could simply be ignored, denied, or erased from memory. The Declaration itself did more than just announce a wish for freedom. It laid out a long list of complaints against the king, unfair taxes placed on the colonists without asking them first, trials held without a fair jury, soldiers living among ordinary citizens during peacetime. Point by point, it built a case almost like a legal argument for why the bond between Britain and its colonies should be considered broken. But a legal argument, however well written, still needed someone willing to stand behind it in person. So Congress made a decision that turned that idea into something far more dangerous. They ordered a formal copy of the Declaration to be carefully written out, every word copied by hand, in neat, official lettering, onto one large sheet of parchment. This was not just a record. It was meant to carry something the rough draft did not yet have. Real signatures, written by real hands, each one a personal, individual commitment to the cause. That formal copy was most likely written by Timothy Matlack, an assistant to the Secretary of Congress, who spent days copying every sentence of the Declaration by hand, in the neat lettering officials used for important state documents. By the time he finished, the parchment held roughly 1,300 words, the same case for independence Congress had approved on July 4th, now ready to receive the names that would make it official. On August 2nd, 1776, most of the delegates gathered together in Philadelphia to sign that formal copy. Most signed that day. A few signed later, over the weeks and months that followed, as they traveled back to the city or changed their mind. But together, all 56 names carried the very same danger It made no difference which week a man picked up the pen. Because under British law at the time, treason against the crown was punished with the harshest penalty the legal system allowed: death. By signing, each man created written evidence against himself. His own handwriting could one day be used in a courtroom. If Britain won the war, that signature could help prove treason. Not every signer in that room faced the same kind of risk or carried the same kind of fear. A wealthy landowner stood to lose an entire estate built up over generations. A respected lawyer risked not only his career, but the good name of his entire family. A delegate from a colony already full of British soldiers was signing a document that some of his own neighbors might one day use against him. Imagine the room itself for a moment. Independence Hall. In the middle of a hot Philadelphia summer, the windows likely shut tight to keep the conversations private. 56 men, dressed in the formal clothing of their time, waiting their turn at a table that held a single sheet of parchment and a small collection of quills. There was no music in this scene, no dramatic speech written for the occasion. Just the quiet, repeated sound of a pen scratching across paper, one name at a time. And still, one by one, they stepped forward to sign. John Hancock, the President of the Congress, signed first, in a large and confident hand. A story has been passed down for generations that he made his signature unusually big on purpose, joking that he wanted the king to be able to read his name without needing his glasses. It is a wonderful detail, bold, funny, memorable. But no one wrote that comment down at the time it supposedly happened. It is a story that has been repeated so often, for so long, that it now feels like established fact. Historians, however, still cannot confirm that Hancock ever said it. A second story, just as famous, is connected to Benjamin Franklin. As the delegates prepared to sign, Franklin is widely quoted as saying, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." It is a sharp line, dark and clever at the same time, exactly the kind of thing people remember and repeat. But the earliest written record of that quote appears decades after 1776, long after Franklin himself had died. He may have said something close to it. He may never have said anything like it at all. Like Hancock's joke about his glasses, it survives today as a story long told, not a confirmed historical fact. What we do know, with real certainty, is something simpler and in many ways more powerful. Not every man in that room signed without hesitation. Some delegates asked for extra time to think the decision through. Some worried, quietly and privately, about the wives and children they were leaving, exposed to a war that had barely begun. For a few colonies, independence itself was still a choice that split opinions, not something everyone celebrated equally. There were neighbors who supported the crown, families divided over which side to trust, and ordinary people who simply wanted the fighting to stop, no matter who won. Even getting to that point had not been simple. Back on July 1st and 2nd, when Congress first voted on independence itself, the colonies had not stood together without friction. Pennsylvania and South Carolina had at first voted against the idea. Delaware's 2 delegates present were split evenly, unable to agree, until a third delegate rode through the night to arrive just in time and settle the vote. New York's delegation did not vote at all, simply because they had not yet received fresh instructions from home. Unity, in other words, had to be built one hesitant colony at a time it did not arrive ready-made. And yet, despite all of that uncertainty, when the moment finally came to put pen to paper, 56 men did exactly that. While the signing continued inside that quiet room in Philadelphia, the war outside was already real and already moving fast. That same summer, British ships began arriving along the coast near New York, carrying the largest military force the British Crown had ever sent across the Atlantic Ocean. By late summer, tens of thousands of British and hired German soldiers had gathered in and around New York Harbor, with Staten Island becoming the main staging ground for the campaign, carried on hundreds of ships under the command of General William Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe. Warships built to land a huge force on American shores, led by commanders who had crossed an entire ocean for exactly this purpose. A fleet gathered with one clear goal: to crush a young rebellion before it had any real chance to grow into something the Empire could no longer control. This was not a distant rumor reaching Philadelphia weeks later. Messengers carried news between cities quickly, and word of the fleet's size spread fast among delegates who understood exactly what it meant. The men signing the declaration were not reacting to a war that might happen someday, in some uncertain future. They were signing it while that war was already arriving, just days and weeks away from the very room where they sat. So picture the scene again, but now with that knowledge sitting underneath it. A quill, the ink barely dry on the page. 56 names, now permanently attached to a single, bold document, names that could never be taken back. And to the northeast, in New York Harbor, an enemy fleet large enough to make every single signer privately wonder the same question. Had they just founded a new nation, or had they just signed away their own lives, in their own handwriting, for the world to see? For most of the war that followed, that question stayed open, unanswered, hanging over every signer like a shadow. And for several of them, it stopped being a fear in the back of their minds and became something they had to live through. Richard Stockton, a delegate from New Jersey, was captured by British forces in November of 1776, only months after he had signed the declaration. He was held as a prisoner, chained, and treated like a common criminal rather than a captured statesman. While he was locked away, his home, an estate called Morven, was occupied by enemy soldiers, and his property was looted, room by room. Stockton was eventually released and returned home, but his health never recovered, and the war had already taken almost everything he owned. Not far from him, in the same state, another signer named John Hart faced a different kind of danger. When British and Loyalist forces moved through New Jersey later that same year, Hart was forced to leave his home and go into hiding, moving from one shelter to another to avoid capture, while his farm and property were damaged in his absence. He died only a few years later, his health and his finances both broken by what the war had cost him. Further south, 3 delegates from South Carolina, Thomas Hayward Jr., Edward Rutledge, and Arthur Middleton, paid a similar price. After the city of Charleston fell to British forces in 1780, all 3 were captured and held as prisoners far away, in Street Augustine, for nearly a year. While Middleton was a prisoner, his family's estate was badly damaged by the occupying army, another signature, another home that suffered for it. 2 more signers, Abraham Clark of New Jersey and George Walton of Georgia, show how far this risk could reach. Clark's own 2 sons were captured while serving in the Continental Army and held under harsh conditions. Walton himself was wounded and captured as a militia officer at the Battle of Savannah in 1778. For both men, the danger they had signed for did not stay on paper. It reached their families and their own bodies. These were no longer risks that lived only in someone's imagination. These were specific men with specific names that are still easy to read on that document today, paying a very real price for a single signature. Through years of war, through capture, through stolen homes and broken health, their names remained on that page. Once written, they could not be quietly taken back. In 1783, the war finally came to an end. The Treaty of Paris was signed, and Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The legal threat that had hung over every single signature for 7 long, uncertain years quietly disappeared into history. No signer was ever put on trial for treason. No signer was ever put to death for what he had written his name to, back in that room in Philadelphia. The very same page that could have become a list of 56 condemned men instead became something else entirely. The most studied, most quoted, most carefully looked after founding document in the country's entire history. Today, that original parchment is kept inside a special protective case in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where millions of visitors walk past it every year, looking for 56 names that almost became a list of the dead. Most of the 56 lived to see independence won. Several went on to serve as governors, judges, and members of the new nation's government. 2 of them, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, would later become President of the United States. Others, like Stockton and Hart, never fully recovered their health or their wealth and lived shorter, harder lives because of what the war had cost them. Their stories did not end the same way, but every one of them kept the name they had written down in 1776. The lesson of this story sits right at the center of that change. Courage, in this case, was never about being certain of the outcome. None of the 56 men knew, in August of 1776, exactly how the war would end, or whether they would live to see it end at all. They signed anyway, long before the outcome was decided, simply because they believed the risk was worth taking. 56 signatures, 56 gambles, one nation that was not yet guaranteed to exist. They signed without knowing the ending of their own story. And 250 years later, the ending is a nation that is still here, still standing, still reading their names. The ink dried long ago. The danger passed, but the names remained. If you enjoyed learning English through stories like this, subscribe for more history, told one chapter at a time.